Hello. Today we're going to consider memory, myth, and moral authority, recalling images of the past in times of crisis. In many respects, it's hard to remember the past, even when it's right in front of us. Buildings like this in modern cities look as though they're just dilapidated or in the process of being torn down. But in fact, this building in particular is a memory to one of the most horrific events in human history. And it's still standing after 75 years of having been hit by a nuclear attack. In Japan, the young are trying to find out about that 75-year-old event from the last few survivors who still exist and can tell their stories.
Today marks 75 years since the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. Another blast hit Nagasaki 3 days later. More than 200,000 Japanese died in the two attacks. The horrifying aftermath has been told and retold by survivors through the years. The youngest of them are today in their late 70s and 80s. Now, a younger generation is trying to ensure that those memories are not lost. Special correspondent Grace Lee in Hiroshima has the story.
In a room full of his peers, 17-year-old Niho Ishibashi asks an important question.
How will young people learn the truth about Hiroshima now?
He learned about the horror from his great-uncle, a survivor of the Hiroshima bombing who lost his eyesight due to the blast.
When August 6th coming, I often go to his house and hear testimonies, yes.
Now, Ishibashi is sharing that testimony with his high school peace studies class. It's a regular part of the curriculum for many schools in Hiroshima, different from the rest of Japan. Takeda High School's program was developed by Vice Principal Muneo Hota.
My father was an A-bomb victim, so I'm second generation of hibakusha.
Hibakusha is the Japanese word for survivors of the atomic bombings. With their numbers dwindling, the race against time to preserve their memories has been a rallying cry for young people in Hiroshima.
I would like to do something that I can keep hibakusha stories in the future.
Some have found unique ways to do just that. At Fukuyama Technical High School's computer club, students are working with virtual reality under the watchful eye of their teacher, Katsushi Hasegawa. They let me experience their project firsthand. With a headset and some earphones, I'm transported to Hiroshima in 1945, before the city is bombed.
We want people to know what happens when nuclear weapons are used. People tend to think about using it to attack others, but nobody thinks about what it's like to have the bomb explode right above your head.
Students here understand that message, especially when they're able to stand right on top of Ground Zero.
There's a park there now, but the site of the bombing used to be a town called Nagashima Honmachi. I hope that by knowing that town existed and seeing it there through VR, people will be able to feel the reality of the atomic bombing.
It's awful to see that a place so beautiful could be turned into a pile of rubble like that. When you watch the moment of the bombing in the VR program, it happens in a second. There's a blinding light and everything is destroyed.
The students aim to show their project to as many survivors as possible in hopes of creating a more accurate version of a pre-bombing Hiroshima. Education about the bombing starts as early as elementary school in Hiroshima. This elementary school tells a story on its own. Located about a third of a mile away from the bombing's epicenter, the school's west wing was the only structure left standing after August 6, 1945. It was used as a relief station for survivors. This part of the school is now a museum. Several of its walls served as message boards for victims trying to reach loved ones.
This is a note from one teacher to another, saying that a badly burnt student undergoing treatment has become orphaned.
Students here make paper cranes every year for the museum. They were seen as symbols of hope after the bombing.
Students know about what happened here. They learn about it in peace studies. The 5th and 6th graders are even trained to be guides for foreign visitors.
Hiroshima Archive is another massive feat by local students. It relied on student volunteers to gather messages from A-bomb survivors and put them onto a digital archive.
So the app shows you where survivors were at the moment of impact. So if you take a look here, you can see we're standing right where this survivor, Michiko Takano, was on that day. And if you click their names, you can see their testimony. This is hers. At that moment, there was a flash, as if someone had lit a huge amount of magnesium on fire, and the house was blasted to pieces. For a moment, I thought our house was hit directly with an incendiary bomb. But when I looked around, the whole city was destroyed, and I saw people covered in gray ash standing in a daze on the street corners. It was like seeing a scene from hell.
This year, ceremonies marking the anniversary of the bombings have been scaled back due to COVID-19. And for survivors like Setsuko Thurlow, the pandemic has been a difficult time.
You know, when I saw a pile of dead bodies of the COVID-19 victims, that reminded me of what I experienced in Hiroshima 75 years ago.
She still remembers vividly what it was like when the bomb hit her hometown.
Although it happened in the morning, it was dark, like twilight. And as my eyes got used to the situation, I started seeing some moving dark object nearing me. And that was a procession of injured people. The parts of the bodies were missing, and the hair was all burnt and standing up. And the skin and flesh were hanging down off the bones. They were bleeding, burnt, blackened, and swollen.
Thurlow is an activist and a leading figure for the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons. For advice to young people, reach out to local politicians.
Get in touch with them. Let them know how you feel. I think you deserve the decent future waiting for you. Your lives are just starting. You deserve better.
Her message is well received in Hiroshima, where the next generation has already been planting their seed.
Hibakusha is passing away a lot year by year, so we should keep this memory, this idea for a long time.
And the generation after that is well on their way.
I'd like to spread any countries what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
On August 6, 1945, 150,000 lives were lost in Hiroshima. 3 days later, another 75,000 people were killed in Nagasaki. 75 years have passed, but their deaths are still fresh on the minds for many here every summer. And every year, new voices are speaking up on their behalf. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Grace Lee in Hiroshima.
It turns out that our memories of these events are even more difficult to square with reality than we may have thought, in part because the memories have been worked on since the events themselves by governments involved in perpetrating the events. We're now finding out that the US government and Hollywood colluded to justify the use of the bomb and put out a very strong narrative about why it was justified and kept from the American public a full understanding of the impact of the bombs.
Today marks the 75th anniversary of the U.S. dropping the bomb, the atomic bomb, on Hiroshima. 75 years ago today. ushering in the atomic age, August 6, 1945. This is J. Robert Oppenheimer, the scientist credited with coordinating the creation of the atomic bomb, head of the Manhattan Project, describing his feelings as the first nuclear explosion in history lit up the Trinity blast site in New Mexico, the test site, on July 16, 1945.
We knew the world would not be the same. Few people laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that one way or another.
Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. That's the scientist J. Robert Oppenheimer quoting the Bhagavad Gita. Well, we turn now to look at how the U.S. government controlled the narrative about the race to build and use the first atomic bomb, especially by controlling how that story was portrayed in the media. This is the focus of a new book called The Beginning or the End: How Hollywood and America Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. The Beginning or the End is also the name of a 1947 movie by MGM. We'll learn more about that and so much more with journalist Greg Mitchell, who's written extensively on Hiroshima and Nagasaki atomic bombings, also the author of Atomic Cover-Up and Hiroshima in America with Robert J. Lifton, former editor of Nuclear Times magazine. It's great to have you with us, Greg. Terrible anniversary, the 75th anniversary of the dropping of the atomic bomb, ushering in the nuclear age. Greg, before we talk about the film, The Beginning or the End, that started to recreate a narrative about what happened, for people who are not familiar with what happened then, the significance of J. Robert Oppenheimer, President Truman's decision to drop the bomb, tell us why the bomb was dropped and the criticism at that time through to today that was not so much heard at the time.
Yes, thank you. Happy to be here. Well, you know, the stated reason for dropping the bomb, which has become what I call the official narrative, really to this day, as we've seen again with the media coverage of the past month, was that it was the only thing that could end the war. It saved a million American lives. The Japanese would not have surrendered. We would have had a costly invasion of Japan, and we really needed to drop the bomb. It was the only thing that worked. This came out in Truman's initial statement, where he called Hiroshima a military base. So from the beginning, it was important to communicate to the American people that this was a decent and necessary act. And of course, evidence has emerged over the decades, which shows that there were alternatives. For example, Truman had just gotten Russia to declare war on Japan, to promise to declare war on around August 9th. And there are many people who believe that Japan, including Truman, believe that Japan would have surrendered quickly after the Russian declaration of war. And so there's all sorts of evidence that has emerged that the use of the bomb was not necessary, could have been delayed or not used at all. But what was important was to set this narrative of justification, and it was set right at the beginning, and by the Truman and his allies, and with a very willing media, and then following that, suppression of evidence from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, confiscation of film footage, photographs, censorship office in Tokyo. My book picks up carrying the story to Hollywood, and I think it tells the whole story of this period and what happened in this crucial turning point oddly through this rather entertaining story about this movie, because the way that Truman and the military intervene to make to adjust the movie and totally get the revisions in the script to reflect this official narrative rather than raise questions about the bomb. And then ultimately, when the movie came out, it was nothing more than propaganda. And so really in the story of this movie, and as I tell in the book, it really reflects so much about this turning point in America where we are set on this path to endorsing the use of the bomb, by most in the media and by, many among the public right to this day.
There was some reporting from English language sources outside the United States, like the Telegraph, warning about how dire situation was in Hiroshima. And this is a report in the Daily Express about the 30th day in Hiroshima. The atomic plague, it was entitled. I write as a warning to the world. Doctors fall as they work. These kinds of headlines never hit the American press and weren't absorbed by the people until, in effect, nearly a year after the dual bombings, an American magazine, The New Yorker, finally commissioned a writer to go and investigate what had happened in Hiroshima. His name was John Hersey, and he was commissioned in 1946 to travel to Asia and find out what the aftermath was of the use of these first ever nuclear weapons and their impact, especially on the fact that they weren't employed for a military purpose, but to kill civilians.
Little was reported about the fate of the people of the city. In May 1946, an American journalist, John Hersey, was asked by the New Yorker magazine to go to China and Japan and write a series of articles. Hiroshima was to be one of his subjects. Nearly a year after the bombing, he found the city devastated. The people still dazed and suffering. The story he brought back so moved the editors of the New Yorker that although they had intended it to be a serial, they devoted an entire issue to it, adding only an introduction. They wanted to show clearly the human consequences of using such a terrible weapon. As a book, it was translated into many languages. Newspapers all over the world serialized it. Radio stations broadcast it. Hersey told for the first time the story of the people of Hiroshima. He took 6 survivors, 6 people who had lived through the unimaginable. There was a young girl, Miss Sasaki, aged 20, an office worker. There was a young doctor, also called Sasaki, but not related to her. There was a Dr. Fuji, who owned a small private hospital. A German priest, Father Kleinsorger. And there was Mrs. Nakamura, a working woman with 3 children whose soldier husband had been killed in the war, and Reverend Tanimoto, a Methodist minister with a wife and baby. Their stories provide a detailed record of that time.
When John Hersey returned from Nagasaki and Hiroshima, he wrote up his article in the New Yorker as a reporter at large. In the August 31st issue of the New Yorker in 1946, many Americans were introduced to the story of the true devastation in Hiroshima for the first time. It was an amazing event. It began with part 1, a noiseless flash, an extraordinary publishing intrusion upon the post-war American consciousness. It appeared with full irony in an issue that had a cover of people playing in the park, delightfully at ease in a late summer setting. But the story was riveting and very revealing to the American public. Eventually it emerged as a standalone book and people bought it up readily. It was then translated into a number of languages all over the world. Eric Schlosser and the contemporary writers expressed enormous appreciation for John Hersey's historic contribution as a journalist in this Hiroshima documentary.
Hersey went to Yale, then he went to Cambridge University, then he worked for a Nobel Prize winning novelist. And he could have had a very comfortable, cushy literary life. And instead, when World War II began, he joined American forces in the Philippines. He went with the Marines as they landed on Guadalcanal. He followed the American army as it tried to drive the Nazis out of Italy. And then he took himself to the place of, I think, one of the most significant historical events, the destruction of Hiroshima. So what I admire is his throwing himself into the midst of the world and engaging with the big issues of his day and trying as a writer to be compassionate and humane and make people think about all of these things. And those tend to be the writers that I admire most, the ones who put themselves out there and assume personal risk in order to tell the world what's happening.
Another figure has emerged recently as a kind of hero of the civil rights struggle in the United States. And memories are pouring forth about people who knew him and recollections of his own speeches and statements over his long period of activism in American history. As in Japan, where students are interested in finding out about the elders and preserving their memory, so too here, John Lewis would meet with students often and talk about the importance of the civil rights struggle.
Welcome. For each of us, there are days that are turning points, a day that changes our personal life or a day that changes the nation. Sometimes, very rarely, it's one and the same day. Just such a day happened to me on Wednesday, August 28, 1963. I was 29 years old, the Deputy Director of the Peace Corps, with offices 1 block from the White House and a short walk from the Lincoln Memorial. That morning, largely on impulse, inspired by a friend, I joined the 250,000 Americans, people of every age and color, who had come for the March on Washington. The event is now most famous for Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech, but like many of the others there, I was first transfixed by one of the other speakers, the youngest on the platform. His name was John Lewis. He had just been named head of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and he was 23 years old. I will never forget the speech he delivered that day.
We must get in this revolution and complete the revolution. For in the Delta of Mississippi, in Southwest Georgia, in the Black Belt of Alabama, in Harlem, in Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, and all over this nation, the black masses on the march for joy and freedom.
In the 5 decades since, John Lewis has become an icon of the civil rights movement, a hero who faced down brutal Southern police in the name of freedom and was beaten bloody for daring to do so. Today, he's a 14-term congressman from Georgia. Recently, he and I returned to the National Mall in Washington to remember that day in 1963 and the march that changed America.
People were all the way down. It was, and you just saw hundreds and thousands of individuals. I'm John Lewis, and I was the youngest speaker. 10 of us spoke. I spoke number 6. Dr. King spoke number 10, and out of the 10 people that spoke that day, I'm the only one still around.
Congratulations.
Well,
Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
It was a great moment in American life.
Yeah, I got to know Dr. King. I met him in 1958 when I was 18, but I first heard of him when I was 15 years old in the 10th grade. We worked together, we marched together, we got arrested together in Selma, Alabama.
Have you ever heard this story before? You have.
I watched it on TV.
You did.
So you know about the sit-ins, the Freedom Ride? Yeah. People marching for the right to vote? Well, I was on the march from Selma to Montgomery. I was beaten. On March 7, 1965, a group of us, about 600 people, black and white, many young people, some people who had just left church, decided to march from Selma to Montgomery, about 50 miles away, because people of color, black people in Alabama, couldn't register to vote simply because of the color of their skin. And we decided to march across the Alabama River, a bridge called the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And we got to the highest point on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and we looked over and we saw a sea of blue, Alabama state troopers. And we got within hearing distance of the state troopers and Major John Cloud of the Alabama state troopers. This is an unlawful march. It would not be allowed to continue.
This is an unlawful assembly. You have to disperse. You are ordered to disperse.
And the young man walking beside me, who was working with Dr. King, said, "Major, give us a moment to kneel and pray." And the major said, "Troopers, advance." I was hit in the head by a state trooper with a nightstick. Had a concussion at the bridge. I thought I saw death. I thought I was going to die.
And when you were attacked by the police, when you were beat, when you were almost killed, you didn't think a moment of responding, replying violently?
No, never, because we studied the way of peace, the way of love, the way of nonviolence. One of the people that beat me on the Freedom Ride in 1961 in South Carolina came to my office later with his son. His son had been encouraging his father to do it. And he said, "Mr. Lewis, I'm one of the people that beat you and left you bloody. Will you forgive me? I want to apologize." His son started crying. He started crying. I started crying. He hugged me. I hugged him. He called me brother. I called him brother.
And today he's the only survivor of the group of leaders who spoke up here on August 28, 1963. Let's go up and look at the spot.
Thank you. Good to see you.
In fact, every living president presented warm words of condolence and admiration for John Lewis in his memorial service at the Ebenezer Baptist Church, with the exception of one president who declined to praise John Lewis and in fact did not go to the event. Well, you could say this is all very good for big struggles in the past, but now we're up against new circumstances. What good is the past when we're facing now something never faced by the human community as a whole on this scale? The coronavirus that is now not only spreading throughout the world, but also mutating and becoming something perhaps more lethal, or at least more easily transmissible. What can the elders who have witnessed both the atomic bombs and the civil rights struggle now tell us about what our priorities ought to be? Well, in fact, we now have amazingly valuable insights and extremely timely advice from an individual who is well over 90 years old. It's worth listening to in detail at length.
The coronavirus is serious enough, but
it's worth recalling that there's a much greater horror approaching. We are racing to the edge of disaster, far worse than anything that's happened in human history. There are two threats that we're facing. One is the growing threat of nuclear war, which has exacerbated by tearing what's left of the arms control regime. And the other, of course, is the growing threat of global warming. Both threats can be dealt with, but there isn't a lot of time. And the coronavirus is a horrible plague. The others, there won't be recovery. It's finished. If we don't deal with them, we're done. And so the childhood memories are coming back to haunt me, but different dimension. Threat of nuclear war. We can get a sense of where the world really is by looking to this January. As I'm sure you know, every year the doomsday clock is set with the minute hand a certain distance from midnight, which means termination. Ever since Trump was elected, the minute hand has been moving closer and closer to midnight. Last year was 2 minutes to midnight, matching the highest it ever reached. This year, the analysts dispensed with minutes, started to move to seconds, 100 seconds to midnight. That's the closest it's ever been, citing three things: the threat of nuclear war, threat of global warming, and the deterioration of democracy. If we're leaving our fit to sociopathic buffoons, we're finished. And that's coming close. Trump is the worst, but that's because of U.S. power, which is overwhelming. U.S. imposes devastating sanctions. It's the only country that can do that. Everyone has to follow. Europe may not like, in fact, hate sanctions on Iran, but they have to follow. They have to follow the master, or else they're kicked out of the international financial system. Now, that's not a law of nature. It's a decision in Europe to be subordinate to the master in Washington. Other countries don't even have the choice. Back to the coronavirus, one of the most shocking, harsh aspects of it is the use of sanctions to maximize the pain, perfectly consciously. Iran has its own enormous internal problems, but by the stranglehold of tightening sanctions, which are consciously designed openly to make the suffer, and suffer bitterly now. Cuba has been suffering from it from the moment that it gained independence, but it's astonishing that they've survived, but they stay resilient. And one of the most ironic elements of today's coronavirus crisis is that Cuba is helping Europe. I mean, this is so shocking that you don't know how to describe it. Germany can't help Greece, but Cuba can help European countries. The civilizational crisis of the West at this point is devastating to think about. The meaning is that if we want to deal with the crisis, we have to move to something like wartime mobilization. So if you think of, take a rich country like the United States, it has the resources to overcome the immediate economic crisis. Mobilization for the Second World War led the country into far greater debt than is contemplated today, and was very successful. Mobilization practically quadrupled U.S. manufacturing, ended the Depression, left the country with enormous debt, but a capacity to grow. Now that's a lesson. We need probably not on that scale. It's not like the Second World War, but we need the mentality to try to overcome the short-run crisis, which is severe. In a civilized world, the rich countries would be giving assistance to those who are in need instead of strangling them, which is what we're doing. Bear in mind that with current tendencies, if they persist, South Asia is going to be unlivable in a few decades. The temperature reached 50 degrees C in Rajasthan this summer, and it's increasing. The water's running out. It could get even worse. There's 2 nuclear powers there who are going to be fighting over reduced water supplies. I mean, the coronavirus is very serious. We can't underestimate it, but we have to remember that it's a fraction, small fraction of major crises that are coming along. They may not disrupt life to the extent that the coronavirus does today, but they will disrupt life to the point of making the species unsurvivable, and not in the very distant future. So we have many problems to deal with. Immediate ones, coronavirus is serious, has to be dealt with, and much larger ones, vastly larger ones, are looming. And there is a civilizational crisis. We have to time possibly good side of the coronavirus, as it might bring people to think about what kind of a world do we want? Do we want the kind of a world that leads to this? And we should think about the origins of this crisis. Why is there a coronavirus crisis? It's a colossal market failure. It goes right back to the essence of markets, exacerbated by the neoliberal, the savage neoliberal intensification of deep social economic problems. It was known for a long time that pandemics are very likely, and it was understood, very well understood, that they are likely to be coronavirus pandemic. Slight modifications of the SARS epidemic 15 years ago. It was overcome. The viruses were identified, sequenced, vaccines were available. The labs around the world could be working right then on developing protection for potential coronavirus pandemics. Why did they do it? The market signals were wrong. The drug companies, we have handed over our fate to private tyrannies called corporations, which are unaccountable to the public, in this case, Big Pharma, and for them, making new body creams is more profitable than finding a vaccine that'll protect people from total destruction. It would have been possible for the government to step in. Going back to wartime mobilization, that's what happened. Polio at the time, I can remember very well, was a terrifying threat. It was ended by the discovery of the Salk vaccine by a government institution set up by the Roosevelt administration. No patents, available to everyone. That could have been done this time, but the neoliberal plague has blocked that. We are living under an ideology for which economists have a good bit of responsibility, so it comes from the corporate sector. An ideology which is typified by Ronald Reagan reading the script handed to by his corporate masters with his sunny smile saying, "Government is the problem. Let's get rid of government," which means let's hand over decisions to private tyrannies that are unaccountable to the public. The point is that this coronavirus pandemic could have been prevented. The information was there to prevent. And in fact, it was well known in October 2019, just before the outbreak. There was a large-scale simulation, high-level simulation in the United States, in the world, of a possible pandemic of this kind. Nothing was done. The crisis was then made worse by the treachery of the political systems, which didn't pay attention to the information that they were aware of. On December 31st, China informed the World Health Organization of pneumonia-like symptoms with unknown etiology. A week later, they identified, some Chinese scientists identified it as a coronavirus. Other countries just ignored it. The worst were the United Kingdom, and the worst of all was the United States. You know, one day there's no crisis, it's just like flu. The next day it's a terrible crisis, and I knew it all along. The next day we have to go back to business because I have to win the election. The idea that the world is in these hands is shocking. But the point is that it started with a colossal market failure, pointing to fundamental problems in the socioeconomic order, made much worse by the neoliberal plague. And it continues because of the collapse of the kinds of institutional structures that could deal with it if they were functioning. As I said, what kind of world do we want to live in? There will be options. The options range from installation of highly authoritarian, brutal states, all the way over to radical reconstruction of society on more humane terms concerned with human needs, not private profit. And we should bear in mind that highly authoritarian, vicious states are quite compatible with neoliberalism. In fact, the gurus of neoliberalism were perfectly happy with massive state violence as long as it supported what they called sound economics. There is the possibility that people will organize, become engaged, as many are doing, and bring about a much better world, which will also confront the enormous problems that we're facing right down the road. The problems of nuclear war, which is closer than it's ever been, and the problems of environmental catastrophe from which there is no recovery. Once we've gotten to that stage, it's over. And that's not far in the distance unless we act decisively.
Fortunately, as he points out, there are things that can be done, but we must act soon and act collectively to preserve our collective survival as a human species on Earth.